Wow, it has been great to learn from these three amazing scholars and to be in this wonderful city that many of you live in and to be with this top-notch team organizing this Festival of Faiths, who it's been just such a delight to experience the thoughtfulness and sensitivity put into all dimensions of the program. And there's an old Yiddish joke that before I speak, I'd like to say something. And that is that my bio is not my story, and that ought to be obvious to us. But I want to address that particular to the younger folks in the room, to remember that our bios are not our stories, our Twitter feeds or Snapchats. These are not our stories. Our external images are very different and can become confusing from actually our deeper sense of being, our deeper sense of purpose in the world. David Brooks famously wrote about in his book on character that we have to learn to distinguish between our resume virtues and our eulogy virtues, right? So many of us today pursue our resume virtues. What can I put on in my public story to help me advance? But actually, what are the points I would want told about me at the end of my life? And how do we spend more time pursuing our eulogy virtues than our resume virtues? And trust that our career and success will flow from there. Jewish stories in their prime are actually not found in words, but in wordless melodies, what's known as the nigun. Today is Kristallnacht, and Kristallnacht was when the Nazi Germans started to burn all the synagogues and burn down all the Jewish businesses and lead pogroms in Germany on this day in 1939. And so, to anyone who's never heard this part of a nigun, it would sound just like a nai-nai. But to anyone whose family experienced this nigun is a story. Hanai, nanai, nai, nai. Nanai, nanai, nai, nai. And that melody goes on for about 5 minutes through a flow of rhythms. And then that melody actually ends with Jews finding refuge in Israel in 1948. And that melody continues. Hi, nai, na, na, nai, na, na, nai, nai, na, na, nai. And it continues in a more hopeful rhythm. And it's actually these melodies, more than any words of stories that are told, that kind of shaped the Jewish psyche and soul through sacred storytelling. Melodies that bind us together. And of course, I shared already so much, as humans we understand our stories, our lives, our purpose through these stories, how they shape us. And the challenge now, as has been discussed, is refashioning ourselves through our stories and refashioning our stories through ourselves. And the threat to humanity, I believe, is to tell the old stories without questions, without adaptations. If the story isn't questioned, rethought, recontextualized for progress and understandings, it can harm. The only choices are not maintain the perfect purity of the story or abandon the story. And to give just two examples where it's so pertinent among so many others, the first is our understanding of humanity in relationship to the natural world. If I look at the Garden of Eden story, I can read that as a sense of dominance. I can do whatever I want to the earth. I can eat any animal I want. Everything is here for me in an anthropocentric worldview. Or I can re-understand that story in light of climate change, in light of the tens of billions of animals slaughtered in factory farming. If I look at the relationship of women in society, and I look to those stories, I could read once again the Garden of Eden as a prescriptive verse, man shall dominate woman. Or I can read that as a descriptive rather than prescriptive verse, that this is what is happening unless we reverse that curse. And of course, there are so many others like that. And so I want to offer just a snapshot of a Jewish epistemic approach to pluralism, which is a variety of ideas that must lead us to difference, disagreement, and adaptation. Now, I want to be clear here that by pluralism, I don't mean a relativism where all sides of an argument are equally valid. and we abandon our cherished absolutes, but rather where we learn how to hold on to our absolutes, but give space for each other's absolutes. America's learning to do this. Democracy is about supporting a process even if you don't like the conclusion. How do we create a space of pluralism where we hold our absolutes and fight for them while creating space for others as well, even when we might find them false or despicable? Now, the story of Judaism, of course, starts with the birth of biblical monotheism and, to some degree, biblical absolutism. But it's a misunderstanding of the Jews to describe them as a people of the book. Because while it is, to some degree, true that is the Hebrew Scriptures, the Torah, is the springboard for the religion and for the people, really, I believe the essence of Judaism as we know it is to be rooted in Talmudic pluralism. And this pluralism is built so deeply into Judaism in an anti-proselytizing ethos, in a sense that there's not one truth we ultimately want to get to. Elie Wiesel famously said, the goal of Judaism was never to make the world more Jewish, but to make the world more human. And so I want to look at just these two figures who are the towers of the birth of the Talmud, starting with the Mishnah and then moving into the Gemara, and Hillel and Shammai, and how they understood this process of conflicting values, conflicting stories, conflicting narratives. It says over here, hopefully you can read that. Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, my name is Shmuly, named after Shmuel, also as Samuel, the book of Samuel, his name is Shmuel in the Hebrew Scriptures. For 3 years, Beit Shammai, meaning the house of Shammai, the school of thought, and Beit Hillel, they disagreed. These ones said the halakha, the Jewish law, is in accordance with our opinion. And these said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion. They disagreed, right? 50-50 down the line, like the election results, right? Ultimately, a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. What? Both sides are the voice of God? However, the halakha is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. The Gemara asks, since both these and those are the words of the living God, why were Beit Hillel privileged to have the halakha established in accordance with their opinion? Get it? So there's a disagreement, and God says, they're both true, right? These are both true, and yet we're going to side with this one. So if they're both true, why do we have to side with one over the other? The Talmud concludes, because they were kindly and modest, they studied their own rulings and those of the opposing camp, and were even so humble to teach the actions of Beit Shammai before theirs. They preserved the opposing opinion and taught the opposing opinion and even taught it before theirs. And so this is the birth of machloket, the Talmudic discourse of disagreement, and the understanding that values are weak. Values are weak if they're absolute. But values in dialectical tension with other values are very strong. Stories are weak. But stories in dialectical tension with competing stories, with competing narratives, are enduring. And so how does this lead us in this conversation around pluralism and particularism versus universalism? It goes over here around the issue of conversion. The Gentile said, this non-Jewish person said, these garments, for whom are they designated? The student said to him, for the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. The Gentile said to himself, I will go and convert, so they will install me as the high priest. He came before Shammai and said, convert me on condition you install me as a high priest. Shammai pushed him away with a cubit in his hand. So then he goes before Hillel, the other camp, and he automatically converted him. We know today that there are those who believe there ought to be exclusivity in faiths. Think about how it's been politicized in ways we might like or not like in the name of the integrity of our faith. Think about the idea of President Biden being denied communion because of his stand on abortion. Think about the idea of President Trump being told he's not a Christian, by the Pope due to his stance on poverty, right? The idea that actually you're not a part of us based upon your view. I want to push you away and reject you and your views, and you're not welcome in this space. But then think of the side of inclusivity, the side of Hillel as opposed to Shammai, that our story is about all of us together, those we like and those we don't like yet. That we ultimately are working to live by an elevated spiritual consciousness. All are one in this interconnected space of souls, those we agree with and those we don't agree with. And so I'm going to show you this third source here to take something very loaded in America as well. This last debate between Hillel and Shammai, although there's dozens of them, coming from the Mishnah of Gittin. Now, the rabbis didn't like the ancient world's notion of slavery, but as a reminder, this is 2,000 years ago. This is not 19th century abolitionists. 2,000 years ago, they're wrestling with this. And here they're dealing with a half-slave. What do we do with this half-slave, one who's born from a free person and a person who is a slave? And it says, one who is a half-slave and half-free, he serves his master one day and then himself one day. That's the words of Beit Hillel, right? He should break up his days. He's half and half. Beit Shammai said, you set it right for his master, but for himself you didn't set it right. To marry a maidservant isn't possible because half of him is free, right? He can't marry anyone. To marry a free woman isn't possible because half of him is slave. So would you cancel his obligation to reproduce? But isn't it true that the world wasn't created except for bearing fruit and reproducing, as it says in Isaiah? Not to be waste did God create her, the earth. To be settled upon her did God form her. Rather, because of setting the world right, mipnei tikkun olam, repairing the world, they force his master, who must make him a free person, and write a contract for him to redeem the remaining half of his value. And Beit Hillel turned to teach according to the words of Beit Shammai. Now that's a fascinating conclusion, mainly because Hillel is normally the authoritative view, and Shammai is who's more of an exclusivist than an inclusivist, more of a particularist than a universalist, is pushed down. But here Shammai wins, and I don't know if you've ever seen on the Twitter feed an argument that ends in, you know what, I thought about your view and you're right. But that's the conclusion here in the Talmud. They disagree on what to do with the half-slave. And Hillel says, you know what, you're right. That half-slave should be liberated, should be freed. And Shammai convinces Hillel that debate actually can be fruitful, and there is too much at stake to not talk. I'll close with this short story. How many of y'all have seen the movie The 10 Commandments? Maybe you were like me as a kid, you were forced to watch this every 3 months, right? The great Charlton Heston, the founder of the NRA, is there as Moshe Rabbeinu, as Moses, and he raises up his staff, and if you look really closely, you can see his Rolex watch popping out, right? The great Moses, right? But back in those days, they couldn't Photoshop it, and there were like thousands crossing through the sea, so they couldn't redo the scene or anything, right? But in that moment, how do they show it? They show one pathway where all the Israelites are walking through, where the sea has been split. But in fact, the Midrash, the Talmudic commentary on that story that reframes it, says, actually, there's not one pathway through the sea, but 12. And there were chomot v'chomot, walls and walls of water between those 12 pathways, right? But there were not only walls of water, there were chalonot v'chalonot, windows and windows between the water. Right? What a cool scene, right? There's these 12 pathways, everyone's marching through with their matzah, and they're looking through, and they can see through these walls of water, these windows. And I think what the rabbis are teaching there is, each of us has our own pathway towards liberation. Whatever our faith or ideology or narrative is, whatever our stories are, we have to walk on our authentic path, not someone else's path. But we need windows to see each other. And that is what is going to get us to a place of liberation, that for us to tell our own stories, listen to each other's stories through those, and see them through those windows, right? And giving dignity to each other's stories while reaffirming the authenticity of our own paths. Thank you so much.